All right. So, viewers and listeners, good day and welcome. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Viewers and listeners, good day and welcome to an interesting and exclusive interview with me, Umar Isa Dandago, on my YouTube channel, Global Arena TV. Like I said, my name is Umar Isa Dandago, and we're recording on Friday, the 15th of November, 2024. That is about a week after the declaration of Donald Trump as the 47th president of the United States of America. And my guest today is Professor Glenn Diesen from the University of Southeastern Norway, one of the most prominent scholars of international relations and European politics, and somebody who knows a lot about the Russian foreign policy and its, approach towards the Ukraine war and its relationship with not only Europe but the rest of the world. He has featured in a lot of interviews on different media outlets. He has a YouTube channel with his name Glenn Diesen, and there's a lot of discussions, conversations, panel interviews there available. I recommend you go and check it out, subscribe, and also follow him. Thank you very much indeed, Professor, for coming back to Global Arena. You are invited to my show, and we had a very lengthy 1 hour conversation with you about the Russian war in Ukraine and the issue of multipolarity in March 2023. And you have generously been so kind to come back this time around, to talk about the Russian war in Ukraine as well, but then to analyze the return of Donald Trump that was feared by many people before the election to be problematic and to sort of change the world order and so on and so forth. For our viewers and listeners also, a few days or about 2 weeks ago, I think, Professor Glenn Diesen had a conversation with the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. And we're going to talk about how that was for him talking to Vladimir Putin. Professor, welcome back to the show. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. It's good to see you again.
All right. Let's start by this with this question. What do you think about Trump's second term beyond America?
Well, I think he has a different approach to foreign policy. I think he's often perhaps misunderstood for being, maybe promoting more peace. I think it's his main objective, I think, is recognizing that the current state of the U.S. empire, it's not sustainable. That is, when you have a huge hegemon, global hegemon like this, it's going to be a very expensive ordeal. Two predictable consequences, which were identified already in the 90s, is the US will begin to exhaust all its resources, and by trying to dominate every corner of the world, it would instigate collective balancing by its adversaries. So this is what's happening. So I think Trump is trying to get a better return on investment, for a lack of a better term. That is, allies should pay more money. Wars that doesn't really pay off well they should disengage from. So they should get out of. Back then, Afghanistan, obviously this is over. Now he wants to get out of Ukraine. In places like Syria, he's willing to stay there to the extent he can take their oil, as he say. So it's more, make the empire more profitable. I think that's what he's going for. And I think Ukraine symbolizes the main war where he's really differs from the rest of the political class, because it's very costly for the United States. They're not winning the war, they're losing it. And also the war is pushing Russia and China closer and closer together. So overall, he sees it as a strategic loss, which is why he wants to disengage. Otherwise, I think there won't be much changes in the Middle East, especially anything related to Israel. And but other parts of the world, I think he's going to try to do max pressure, but try to avoid the use of force.
Well, I think you've jam-packed a lot of things. Let's see if we can unpack them piece by piece, starting with the war in the Middle East, which a lot of critics of the West term as genocide, and the people there also call it a genocide. Well, Professor, Donald Trump, prior to his election or re-election, he promised, especially the Muslim communities in Michigan, that he was going to bring an end to the war in Gaza and ultimately the war in Lebanon as well. But then his critics in the US and beyond are saying that you cannot believe a single word that comes out of Donald Trump or Donald Trump's mouth. Do you think he has a leverage over Netanyahu and Israel in general, and that he can call the shots and order them to stop the war?
Possibly. Well, let me just first say I think I agree with that categorization to call it a genocide. It's by the actions and also the intentions which are expressed by the Israeli leadership. I think it very much qualifies as a genocide, which then has wider implications because the United States are the main actor which is enabling this genocide, and you also have several European countries such as Germany who are also actively backing the genocide. So it is quite severe and of course horrific what's happening there. With Donald Trump though, it's what makes the Middle East so a bit confusing, if you will, is because on one hand the Israelis are, got themselves in a lot of trouble. Not only are they stuck in Gaza, but they're also now stuck in Lebanon. They have problems with Yemen, different groups in Iraq and Syria. They also have the prospect of a possible war with Iran. There's no way for them to solve this. I think a key strategy has attempted to pull the Americans into the war. Now, for Trump, who wants to end the forever wars and make the empire less costly, this would be an utter disaster for him. So I think it's quite genuine when he says he wants to get an end to this war. The problem is that it's also supportive of everything that Israel does. So it begs the question: when these two priorities come in conflict, which one will he choose? Again, I could only speculate. But I assume that he will try to bring an end to the war. But the question is, what happens when Israel doesn't listen? Is he willing to effectively, put the law down, say, this is what we demand, you do as you're told, otherwise we're going to cut off your military aid? Or will he have to show his loyalties to Israel by effectively, just following whatever Netanyahu does? I would like it to be the former, but again, I wouldn't be too confident that he's prepared to stand up to Tel Aviv.
All right. So let's move to the Ukrainian war, for example. Do you think Donald Trump can bring an end to the war in Ukraine? And if he succeeds, is do you also share the view that it could be or it will be at the detriment of the Ukrainians, and that the deal could favor or will favor, as the fear has been circulating, will favor the Russians?
Well, obviously, a peace now going to favor the Russians, and a peace now will be also a very humiliating peace for Ukraine, because what the Russians demand is neutrality for Ukraine, which would mean it would have no real security guarantees in the future if there would be other conflicts. Also, they demand territorial concessions. So for oblasts plus Crimea, this is what the Russians are calling for. So it's a huge, painful defeat. But whether or not this is bad for the Ukrainians, I wouldn't necessarily say so, because I think the alternative is simply more war. And in this war, the Ukrainians are losing hundreds of thousands of men. The society is collapsing. The Russians are taking more territory by the day. And the entire survival of the Ukrainian nation could come at stake. So I think the humiliating defeat, I think, is through a peaceful settlement is the best thing at the moment of what they have possible to achieve. So I'm not sure. I think Trump also there genuinely wants to end the war. Obviously, this idea of ending it in the first 24 hours, I don't think that's realistic. But he will try to end it. The problem is, how will the war end? I think so far he proposed things like, let's well, he hasn't officially opposed it, but the people are talking to him say, let's freeze the front lines, and then we can, talk about Ukraine joining later in 10, 20 years, but not right away. For the Russians, this is completely unacceptable because we already did this before. In 2015, we had the Minsk agreement. We froze the front lines. We're going to implement a peace agreement. Instead, what the NATO countries did is they used this time to simply arm Ukraine to fight the Russians, build a big Ukrainian army to fight the Russians a few years later. So this is not something that the Russians will accept. They will demand a political settlement. So the most important thing is to restore Ukraine's neutrality, which means no NATO, and the NATO soldiers and weapon system has to get out of Ukraine. But this was the deal in the early 2022. Over the last 3 years, we had a war with territorial changes. So what they say now is they want Istanbul Plus, which is neutrality plus territorial concessions. My concern is if Trump, this is not the deal he wants, he will put a lot of pressure on Russia. But for Russia, this is a war of its existence. It's an existential threat. So they're not going to be able to have much room to maneuver to give him what he wants. And what Trump will do then when, he's not able to show strength and get a good deal, it's unclear.
Well,
But
are you trying to say that Trump could not have the ears of Vladimir Putin, despite the fact that the whole world knows that there's a personal or special relationship between the two guys?
Yeah, well, a personal relationship can be good. It's a lubricant to have some dialogue going to be able to make deals. But again, for the Russians, this is for the past 30 plus years, they see now NATO march on their borders. For the past 10 years, they had a proxy war in Ukraine. They can't, even if they think that Trump is genuine, when Trump goes away in 4 years, the next guy coming in can want to maybe restart the Ukraine war again. So they will want a political settlement. So, but again, the fact that Trump is speaking about diplomacy, wanting to end the war, I think this is all very positive. So hopefully it goes this way, but because there's been so much death and misery in Ukraine now, I think this instinct of simply ending the war should be a priority of its own. Hopefully it will, but there's no good solutions anymore to this war because for Russia to feel safe, it will demand a security guarantee or neutrality for Ukraine, which will make Ukraine very insecure. So there's no good way of resolving this. The problem is now that the Russians obviously are winning the war. There's no denying this. So this means that the Russians will be able to set a lot of demands. Some of them maybe, Trump would not be able to live up to.
Yeah, of course, a lot of people have been complaining about the fact that your analysis is so sympathetic to or sympathetic for or supportive of the Russian, if I could use this word, empire or the Russians in general. And that is why they think you may have some special relationship with them. But then the Western media have been clamoring, have been saying that the Russians have invited the North Koreans to fight for them. And it seems like you've been indicating that the Russians are the ones winning in this war. How come, if they are winning, then they invited foreign allies to come into the war and join them and fight for them or fight together with them?
Well, let me just first address your first topic or the first issue, because I've heard this before, taking the Russian side, but I never actually supported this war, the invasion to begin with. I think the war is horrific. I don't support the war at all. So, this is not correct. But it's just when you do a security analysis, what if you want to understand Russian policy, first you have to assess what is threatening them and what are the possibilities to respond in terms of their objectives should be matched by their capabilities. So from this, it's just very difficult in the West because you're not allowed to explain that Russia has security concerns. If you try to explain what Russia's doing, they say, well, now you're legitimizing it, you're taking their sides. I think the most important thing in international security is you should be able to put yourself in the shoes of the other guy to understand the position they are in. And the main problem is we effectively presented an existential threat to them, and this is what they're reacting to. So I think presenting as taking their side, I would like, I don't see this necessarily. And I forgot the second part of your
Yeah, yeah,
question.
yeah. Okay, yes,
Or the
definitely.
North Koreans, the North
Yeah,
Koreans.
to
Well,
clarify this, you are not in support of what the Putin guys have been doing in Ukraine, of course, right?
I think, often people
Just
say, are
giving
you
your own
pro?
objective analysis.
Yeah. Well, people say, are you pro-Russian? I think it's very strange because I would like to unpack what exactly that means. I mean, I think, Russia's a great country. It's great people. It's a nice culture. I think, I hope things will go well for them. I hope I'm also pro-Ukrainian from this sense. I hope they will also, be strong and have a prosperous future. But I don't think it's healthy to be anti-entire nations. I think this is, dangerous and ridiculous.
Yeah.
But in terms of the North Koreans, I haven't seen them yet. This is why I'm a bit skeptical of. It might be true, but surely if they have all these tens of thousands of North Koreans, we would have some footage of them actually fighting. So it doesn't mean that this is only dreamt up in the offices of Western propagandists. It's very possible that the Russians are using this as well to create some uncertainty. A key problem for the Russians is, as NATO and Ukraine are losing the war, NATO is responding with escalations. That is to send long-range missiles, strike deeper in Russia, support invasion of Russian territory. So again, more and more escalation. So what the Russians need is effective to restore their deterrent, to deter the West from escalating. But to do this, they also don't want to trigger another, like a World War III. So they can't suddenly start bombing Washington and then, call this a retaliation, because then you probably have the end of the world. I first, at least the way I interpret it, is that they would use the North Koreans as a deterrent. That is, if the West escalate the war in Ukraine with more powerful weapons, then the Russians will unleash North Koreans effectively into the European heartland, which is not necessarily very popular. But I haven't actually seen the North Koreans. Again, it's possible they're coming. I'm a little bit skeptical. But also I think that the Russians are a bit careful, because that would also be a huge escalation to bring North Korea into a European war. And if they actually do this, the West could respond in unpredictable ways. So I think it's more better as a psychological tool, keep the North Koreans somewhere in the rear, just create some concerns and caution in the West. I think this is their main tool. But the idea that Russian military officers going to command North Korean soldiers in Ukraine is, I have a hard time seeing it. But of course, I could be wrong. This could happen.
Yeah, definitely, because even the impossible could be possible at a time of war, because it's a fight for survival and influence and so on and so forth. Professor Glenn Diesen, we have 5 minutes to go. Let's briefly talk about BRICS and its expansion. We have seen recently how the BRICS summit took place in Kazan in Russia, and it has expanded so far by inviting Iran and other Middle Eastern countries, even though Saudi Arabia did not officially accept the invitation. And I think Nigeria, also my country, did not officially accept the invitation. In terms of multipolarity, something you are passionately interested in, what does BRICS and its expansion mean for the Russian allies, now the Russian bloc, the Sino-Russian bloc, and the Western bloc, the G7 and G20 guys?
Well, I think it's a system of getting of reducing dependence on the United States, because under a hegemonic system that is an economic infrastructure under US control, the only way you can be prosperous and trade is if you link yourself and make yourself dependent on the American economic tools, which strengthens the United States. I think what BRICS attempts to do is enable all countries in the world to use different centers of technologies and use different transportation corridors, use different banks, different currencies, not necessarily make it China-centric or Russia-centric for that sake, but rather make it anti-hegemonic. So I think there's even a reluctance to make the BRICS into a bloc, because a key purpose of BRICS is to avoid bloc politics. Instead, you want to avoid these alliance systems and instead they simply diversify, so you don't have this immense concentration of power. And I think that's also the appeal, because if like at least most people I speak to also, you mentioned this in Valdai now, most of the people I talk to from China, India, all of them are essentially saying the same thing. They would like to see BRICS as an anti-hegemonic grouping, so one that diminishes hegemony, but they don't want to be anti-American. So this is two very different things, and the difference would be, you simply diversify your economic ties. You would make it less America-centric, but you will still want to deal with America, because if you're a bloc, you would want to, try to isolate the United States. But the main purpose is America is an important pillar in the international system. So if you're Turkey, for example, you want to keep your economic ties with America. It's an important pole of power, but you also want to deal with the Europeans. You want to deal with the Russians. You want to deal with the Chinese, the Indians. This way you avoid too much dependence on one state. Now, if you cut out the Americans, now it becomes very heavy leaning towards China, so that's not in their interest either. So they don't want to avoid this. They don't want to switch from American bloc to a Chinese bloc. They simply want the option of having multiple partners, so they can have more independent foreign policy, more political autonomy, and also better or more economic prosperity. So I think this is what they're going for. If BRICS starts to define itself as an anti-American bloc, I think many countries will jump off, because they don't want to join this, they don't want to do this bloc politics from the Cold War. I think that's something they endeavor to overcome.
And it seems like the Russians are trying to assert themselves as the leader or the leaders of this BRICS bloc, and simply because despite the war in Ukraine, even the IMF has projected recently that the Russian economy has been doing fine despite the Western sanction against it. What's the secret? What sort of secret has Vladimir Putin used and applied to make his economy so resilient to the Western sanction?
Well, they began to make it sanction-proof, I would say, really back in 2014, because ever since the 1980s, you had, Gorbachev wanting to do this greater or common European home. And after the Cold War, the Russian main foreign policy was simply, let's try to integrate into Europe, have an inclusive European system where Russia has a seat at the table, and this was the main policy. But they made themselves excessively dependent on the West, and the West could begin to dictate all the terms to the Russians. And we even began to construct a Europe without the Russians, because there was nothing they could do about it. Biden once mocked the Russians, saying, "What are you going to do? Are you going to go to China? Are you going to go to Iran? There's no other ones. The worst deal from the West is the only deal on the table." So, but in 2014, this is when the Russians gave up, when the West toppled the government in Ukraine. They realized, we wanted Ukraine to be a front line, not a bridge. And at this point, the Russians began to they abandon what they called Greater Europe, and now they pursue Greater Eurasia. Because keep in mind, 2014, the same time we toppled the government in Ukraine, this is about the same time the Chinese come out to build this Belt and Road Initiative. That's when they begin to aspire for taking leadership in the main technologies. They begin to develop this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. They develop all this payment systems. They begin to try to internationalize their own currency. So all of these things happening. So you have this powerful rise of China at the same time as the Europeans are effectively doing a final divorce with Russia. After this, the Russians began to reorient their entire economy towards the east. So China, India, but also the global south. Africa, I think, is a very important priority for Russia as well. And after a while, the West noticed that Russia becomes less and less dependent on the West. It doesn't need its banking system, its money, its investments, its technologies. So it's overcoming it. And then, of course, in 2022, we put the sanctions on. as tight as we can. As we stole hundreds of billions of dollars from the Russians, legalized the theft. We do all these things, and now not only Russia is learning to live without the West, but you even see the rest of the world. The Chinese know they're next in line. The big countries like India, they would like to be able to trade with whom they want, such as Russia, without Washington, punishing them. So, with the concern of secondary sanctions and everything else, it became a momentum for the whole world to begin to decouple a bit more from the United States. Not decouple, but make themselves less dependent on the US. So there's huge changes happening now. And a lot of this is also a consequence from Ukraine, not just 2022, but 2014. So this has been going on now for a decade. So I think this is also a good reason for the US to want to end this proxy war, because the proxy war over the past 10 years in Ukraine has caused a decoupling from the dollar, which Trump says would sink American empire. So I think it's not in America's interest anymore, really, to continue this war against Russia.
Well, I don't have to take too much of your time. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Glenn Diesen. I hope we'll be able to get you back anytime soon when you are less busy, Professor. What can you say about this program?
Oh, excellent. So thank you. I'm happy to come back.
I hope you enjoy the conversation and the topics, the questions we have, the topics we have covered, and the questions I put to you.
No, very much so. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Glenn Diesen, and on behalf of everyone that has contributed towards the production of the show, my name is Umar Isa Dandago, and saying thank you once again to Professor Glenn Diesen. Goodbye.
Bye.